Okay, so picture this. You're an alien, and you're like cruising into Earth's atmosphere for the first time. What's the first thing that just blows your mind?
I'd have to say probably all the life everywhere you look.
Right. It's like trees the size of skyscrapers and teeny little insects just crawling everywhere and like glowing jellyfish in the ocean.
It'd be pretty wild, wouldn't it?
Totally. I mean, that brings us to what we're diving into today, which is how many different species are actually on Earth?
Well, and that's the thing, isn't it? We don't actually know the exact number.
Whoa, really?
Yeah, like we've described over 1.5 million species so far, but scientists think there could be millions more.
Millions more. Okay, that's kind of crazy.
It is, especially when you consider how many places are really hard to get to, like the deep sea or rainforests. It's like we've only just started to figure out what's out there.
Okay, but you said described species, so what does that even mean?
Well, it means scientists have officially identified them, given them a name, and categorized them.
Oh, I see. But earlier you mentioned biodiversity, so is that just about counting up every single species?
Not exactly, no. Biodiversity is kind of like this big, broad term. It's about all the variety of life, from the genes within a single species all the way up to, like, entire ecosystems.
Oh, okay, so it's like levels of variety.
Yeah, exactly. Think of it like a spice market.
Okay.
You walk in and you've got like rows and rows of spices, right? So many different kinds.
Right.
But even within a single jar, you'll have variations, right? Like
Yeah.
different colors, different sizes, all that.
Oh, okay, yeah. So it's not just how many spices, it's also about all the little differences within each spice.
Exactly.
So how does that spice idea translate to actual species out in the world? Like, what's the real world version of those variations in the spice jar?
So that's genetic diversity.
Okay.
Like, say you've got rice. There are tons of varieties of rice, right?
Yep.
And some might be better suited to different climates or might be more resistant to certain diseases.
So basically, the more variety in the genes, the better chance a species has of adapting or surviving no matter what happens.
Right, exactly. It's like having more tools in your toolkit to deal with whatever challenges come up.
I like that. So genetic diversity is like within a single species. What's the next level up?
So then you have species diversity, which is basically just the number of different species in a given area.
Okay, simple enough. So a rainforest would have way more species diversity than, say, a desert.
Yeah, for sure. You might find hundreds of tree species in a rainforest, but only a handful in a desert.
Makes sense. And then zooming out even further, we get to like the whole forest or the whole desert as an ecosystem, right? Isn't that the next level?
You got it. That's ecological diversity, all the different types of ecosystems on Earth, from forests to grasslands to coral reefs.
Okay, cool. So we've got these like layers of diversity. But I've always wondered, why are the tropics always the like superstars of biodiversity? What makes that area near the equator so special?
Ah, that's a classic question and a good one. It's what we call the latitudinal diversity gradient. Basically, the closer you get to the equator, the more species you tend to find.
So what, the tropics are just like a party for life and everyone wants to be there?
Kinda, yeah. Well, one idea is that the tropics have been really stable over millions of years, unlike other parts of the world. Like, they haven't gone through those crazy ice ages that wipe everything out.
Oh, right.
So life in the tropics has had all this time to evolve and diversify.
Fascinating. So it's like they got a head start and everyone else had to like hit the reset button a few times?
Yeah, exactly. That stability has made the tropics like the ultimate breeding ground for new species.
Okay, I'm starting to get the picture. But here's a random thought I've always had. Does the size of a place matter? Like, does a bigger area automatically have more species?
You know, that's a really good question. And it turns out there is a relationship between the size of an area and how many species you'd expect to find there. Yeah, it's called the species area relationship. Think about it. A giant continent is going to have way more different types of habitats and resources than a tiny island, right? More places for things to evolve.
Yeah. So bigger usually means more species, at least up to a point, I guess.
Yeah.
But is it like a predictable pattern?
That's what's cool. It's actually pretty predictable. It's like a rule of thumb that scientists use to understand how life spreads out across the planet. And it's important for conservation because it helps us figure out how big protected areas need to be to actually do their job.
Oh, right, because if you're trying to protect a bunch of species, you need to make sure they have enough space. Right?
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. But I've got to ask, this is something I've always wondered about. Does the exact number of species actually matter for how ecosystems work? Like, would a forest even notice if one tiny species of beetle went extinct?
Well, that gets into some pretty deep questions about what it means for an ecosystem to be stable. Like, is it about staying exactly the same forever? Or is it more about being able to handle changes and bounce back? Honestly, we're still figuring that out.
Yeah, I guess that's a lot more complicated than just counting things up, huh?
Yeah. But what we do know is that every species plays a role, and losing species can definitely have ripple effects throughout the ecosystem. It's kind of like this analogy.
Oh, is this the rivet popper one?
Yeah.
I've heard of that one, but go on, explain it.
So imagine an airplane, right?
Right.
And each rivet is like a species. You could probably pop a few rivets out and the plane would be fine.
Yeah, probably no big deal at first.
But eventually, especially if you start popping out the important rivets, the whole thing is going to fall apart.
Whoa, yeah. That's a little terrifying when you think about it that way.
Right. And the problem is we're losing species way faster than we should be. Like, current extinction rates are crazy high compared to what would be natural.
How high are we talking?
Estimates say maybe 100 to 1,000 times higher than what they should be. And in the last 500 years, over 784 species have gone extinct, at least the ones we know about.
Okay, that's really grim. I mean, it feels like we need to figure out how to stop this.
We do. And to understand the solutions, we need to understand what's causing it. There are four main culprits, which we call the evil quartet.
Okay, let's hear it. Who are the bad guys?
So number one is habitat loss and fragmentation, which basically means we're destroying and breaking up natural habitats as humans expand our footprint.
I'm guessing this is especially bad in the rainforests, since they're so diverse in the first place.
Unfortunately, yeah, like the Amazon rainforest, which is often called the lungs of the planet, is being chopped down at a crazy rate. And it's not just about losing the trees, it's about all the species that live there and depend on those trees.
Right, yeah. Like it's a whole web of life that gets destroyed. So what's the next villain on the list?
So then there's overexploitation, which is basically when we take too much from nature, whether it's overfishing, hunting, or harvesting plants.
Right, that makes sense. Like turning a need into greed.
Exactly.
Okay, who else is in the evil quartet?
Next up is alien species invasions.
Oh, like those invasive weeds that take over my garden?
Yeah. Basically, when a species is introduced somewhere it doesn't belong and it doesn't have any natural predators, it can just take over and mess up the whole ecosystem.
Right, I've seen that happen. So who's the last member of this quartet?
The last one is co-extinctions, which are kind of like a chain reaction.
Co-extinctions, what does that mean?
So imagine a certain type of flower goes extinct.
Okay.
Well, maybe there's a specific bee that only pollinates that flower.
Oh, so if the flower disappeared.
The bee might disappear too because it can't survive without it.
Right, and then maybe a bird that eats that bee also disappears.
Exactly. It's all connected.
Okay, so this evil quartet is definitely not messing around. But there's got to be something we can do about it, right? Mm-hmm. What are our options?
Well, the good news is that we're not powerless. There are lots of things we can do, and they basically fall into two categories: in situ conservation and ex situ conservation.
Hold on, remind me, what do those terms mean again?
So think of it this way. In situ is like protecting a valuable book in its original library.
Okay.
Whereas ex situ is like making a backup copy of that book and storing it somewhere safe, like a vault.
Oh, okay, I get it. So in situ is about protecting species in their natural habitats, and ex situ is about protecting them somewhere else.
You got it.
Cool. So tell me more about how each of those approaches actually works.
Well, in situ conservation focuses on protecting entire ecosystems, things like national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, or those biosphere reserves. Basically setting aside land and water where human activities are restricted.
So making safe zones where nature can just do its thing.
Exactly. But sometimes protecting the habitat isn't enough. That's where ex situ conservation comes in. So think of things like zoos, botanical gardens, seed banks, places that conserve species outside of their natural environment.
Oh, okay. So that's like a backup plan for those species that are really in trouble.
Right, and those ex situ methods are getting more and more sophisticated all the time.
This is all really fascinating. But I'm realizing we haven't even really talked about why we should care about biodiversity in the first place.
Yeah.
Like, why does it even matter?
That's a great point. I think that's something we should definitely dig into.
Yeah. Like, what's at stake here, really?
Exactly.
So we're back and ready to tackle this big question of, like, why does biodiversity even matter?
Right. Like, why should we care about all these millions of species, especially the ones we might never even see?
Exactly. It's easy to get caught up in the numbers and all the science, but I think it's important to, like, zoom out and remember why this is all important.
Absolutely. And the truth is, biodiversity is kind of the foundation for everything. Like, it's not just about saving cute animals. It's about our own survival, really.
Okay, so how do we even start to think about that? Like, how does biodiversity impact us?
Well, one way to look at it is through what we call the narrowly utilitarian view.
Narrowly utilitarian. What does that even mean?
So basically, it's all about the direct benefits we get from nature, the things we need to survive.
Okay, like food and water and stuff?
Exactly. Like, think about where all our food comes from. Ultimately, it all comes from plants and animals.
Right, of course.
And the diversity of those plants and animals is what keeps our food supply stable and resilient.
Oh, okay. So, like, if we only had a few types of crops and one of them got wiped out by a disease or something.
Exactly. We'd be in big trouble. But if we have a lot of variety, we have more options and more chances of something surviving.
That makes sense. And what about medicine? I've heard that a lot of our medicines come from plants.
You're right. A huge percentage of the drugs we use are derived from plants, and we're still discovering new ones all the time. Who knows what cures might be hidden in the rainforests we're losing?
It's like we're burning down the library before we've even read all the books. Okay, so that's the narrowly utilitarian view, the direct benefits we get from nature. What about the broadly utilitarian perspective?
So that one zooms out a bit further. It's about the ecosystem services that biodiversity provides, the things that nature does for us, even if we don't always see them.
Ecosystem services. Can you give me some examples?
Sure, think about pollination. Insects, birds, even some gnats. They're all out there pollinating plants. And those plants include a lot of the crops that we eat.
Right. I never really thought about it that way. We totally depend on those pollinators.
We do. And another big one is climate regulation. Forests play a huge role in absorbing carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen, which helps keep our climate stable.
So it's not just about saving the trees, it's about saving ourselves.
Right. And forests also do things like purify water, prevent soil erosion, regulate river flow, all sorts of things that we need for a healthy planet.
Okay, wow. So biodiversity is kind of like the engine that keeps the whole planet running smoothly.
That's a great way to put it. And the more diverse an ecosystem is, the more resilient it is to disturbances and the better it can provide those services.
This is all making me think about how interconnected everything really is.
Yeah.
Like, we depend on all these other species, even if we don't always realize it.
Exactly. And that brings us to, like, the ethical arguments for protecting biodiversity.
Oh, right. So we've talked about the practical benefits, but what about the, like, moral reasons?
Well, this is where we get into the idea that every species has intrinsic value. Like, it has a right to exist simply because it is.
But it's about respecting all life, not just the stuff that's useful to us.
Right. It's about acknowledging that we share this planet with millions of other species, and we have a responsibility to protect them. It's about humility and respect for the web of life.
I like that. Okay, so we've talked about why biodiversity matters, but where do we even start when it comes to protecting it? We've touched on in situ and ex situ conservation, but are there other approaches that are, like, particularly effective?
There are, and one that's been getting a lot of attention is the idea of biodiversity hotspots.
Biodiversity hotspots, what are those?
So basically, they're areas that have a really high concentration of biodiversity, like way more than you'd expect for their size.
Okay.
And they often have a lot of endemic species, meaning species that are only found in that specific place.
Oh, wow. So they're like these little pockets of unique life that are super important to protect.
Exactly. And because they're so rich in biodiversity, they become top priorities for conservation.
Makes sense. But how many of these hotspots are there? It sounds like something we should be keeping track of.
Oh, we are. Right now, there are 34 recognized biodiversity hotspots around the world.
34? Wow, and how much of the Earth do they cover?
Only about 2% of the land surface.
2%? That's tiny.
It is. But even though they cover such a small area, they're estimated to contain over 50% of all plant species and 42% of all terrestrial vertebrates.
Wait, so over half of all plant species are crammed into just 2% of the land. That's amazing. And you mentioned earlier that India has a few of these hotspots, right?
That's right. India has 3. The Western Ghats, the Indo-Burma region, and the Himalayas.
Wow. So you can experience incredible biodiversity just within India. But knowing how precious these hotspots are, I'm curious, what are the best ways to protect them? Is it all about setting up protected areas?
Protected areas are definitely a big part of it, but it's not the only solution. We need a multifaceted approach that uses both in situ and ex situ conservation strategies.
Okay, so remind me again, what's the difference between those two approaches?
Sure. So in situ conservation is all about protecting species in their natural habitats. Things like setting up protected areas, managing ecosystems sustainably, and restoring habitats that have been degraded.
Okay, so basically trying to keep things as close to natural as possible.
Exactly. But sometimes that's not enough. And that's when we turn to ex situ conservation, which is about protecting species outside of their natural habitats, like in zoos, botanical gardens, or seed banks.
Right, right. So it's like a backup plan for when things get really bad.
Exactly. And those ex situ methods are constantly evolving. We're seeing new technologies being used, like cryopreservation and tissue culture.
It's amazing how science can help us protect biodiversity. But I'm also wondering about the human side of things. Like, it can't just be about scientists and governments doing all the work, right? Don't communities need to be involved too?
You're absolutely right. Conservation needs to involve everyone. We need collaboration between governments, communities, indigenous people, scientists, conservation organizations, everyone.
So it's about recognizing that we're all connected to nature and we all have a role to play in protecting it.
Exactly. And that leads to a really important question. What are those roles? Like, what can we actually do to make a difference for biodiversity?
Okay, so we're back, and I'm ready to talk about what we can actually do to protect biodiversity. Because it's easy to feel kind of helpless, you know? Like, what can one person really do in the face of all these huge problems?
Right. I hear that a lot. But the truth is, there's a ton we can do, both as individuals and as a society.
Okay, let's break it down. Where do we even start?
Well, one really important piece is policy and legislation. Like, governments need to create laws that protect biodiversity, and that means things like protecting endangered species and regulating harmful activities like, deforestation.
So it's like setting the rules of the game so everyone's playing fair.
Exactly. Strong policies are like the foundation for everything else. But it can't just be top-down either. It's also really important to engage local communities.
Oh, right, because they're the ones who live closest to nature and see the problems firsthand.
Exactly. And they often have this, deep knowledge of the ecosystems they depend on.
So how do we get communities involved?
Well, there are tons of amazing examples of community-led conservation efforts happening all over the world. Like, some communities are creating their own protected areas or managing forests sustainably. Others are working with scientists to track wildlife or developing ecotourism initiatives. It's really inspiring.
That is awesome. It's like empowering people to be stewards of their own natural heritage.
Exactly. And another crucial piece of the puzzle is education, because we can't protect what we don't understand, right?
Right, totally.
Yeah.
We need to teach people about biodiversity and why it matters.
Exactly. And that includes everyone, from kids in school to, adults making decisions about how to use land and resources.
So policy, community involvement, and education, those are the big things, huh?
They are, but individual actions matter too, even if they seem small. Because when millions of people make small changes, it can add up to a big impact.
Okay, so what are some things that, like, everyday people can do? Because sometimes it feels like, what difference can I really make?
Well, for starters, think about your consumption habits. Can you reduce your carbon footprint? Choose sustainably sourced products. Support local farmers. Little things like that can make a real difference.
So it's about being mindful of, like, where things come from and the impact our choices have.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just about what you buy. What about your garden? Can you plant native species that help pollinators and other wildlife?
I love that idea. It's like creating little pockets of biodiversity right in your own backyard. And I guess it's also important to just, like, get out into nature and appreciate it.
That's huge. The more we connect with nature, the more we're likely to care about protecting it. And hey, have you thought about volunteering with a conservation organization or donating to a cause you support?
Those are great ideas, too. So basically, there are tons of ways to get involved no matter who you are or what you do.
Exactly. Whether it's advocating for better policies, supporting sustainable businesses, or just picking up trash in your local park, every little bit helps.
This whole conversation has been really eye-opening. I'm definitely feeling more inspired to take action.
That's awesome to hear, because at the end of the day, protecting biodiversity is not just about science or politics. It's about all of us recognizing that we're part of this incredible web of life, and that we have a responsibility to protect it, not just for ourselves, but for future generations.
That's a really powerful message. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, everyone. We hope you learned something new and are feeling motivated to get involved in protecting biodiversity. Remember, even small actions can make a big difference.